Crockett dares to question the untouchable power of Justice Amy Coney Barrett after a secretive ruling shields a pharma giant from billions in tax penalties. As the nation watches, the truth unravels. Shredded emails, hidden ties, and betrayal buried in black robes. Jasmine doesn't shout, she asks, and the silence that follows shakes the foundation of the Supreme Court. But when the FBI walks in with a subpoena, will justice finally be served? Or will the system bury its own sins? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside the Senate Judiciary Chamber was sharp with tension, thicker than politics, heavier than routine oversight. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a spectacle cloaked in constitutional procedure. The room had been rearranged to accommodate a special panel, and every seat was taken. Journalists, legal scholars, federal clerks, and a few quiet, alert faces from the West Wing. At the center sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett, flanked by counsel, not on the bench but at a long oak table like any other witness. The irony was brutal. A sitting Supreme Court justice under questioning, not about philosophy, but about alleged personal benefit from a ruling that wiped away a $4.7 billion tax fraud case against Crockett Biotech, a pharmaceutical giant with political friends and offshore accounts. No one dared breathe wrong. Outside, the Capitol steps overflowed with protesters, waving signs that read "Justice for Sale" and "Independence or Illusion." Inside, every camera was locked on a single seat across from Barrett, the one held by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine sat still, her posture calm but coiled. She didn't flinch as the gavel fell, and the chairwoman gavelled the hearing into order. She was here to ask questions no one else would touch. Not because she wanted to, but because no one else dared. And that wasn't because she lacked experience. She'd earned every inch of this moment through gritted teeth and sleepless nights. But across this room, she was already being dismissed by the suits who whispered when she walked in, by the legacy columnists who asked if she was grandstanding, by Barrett herself who hadn't once made eye contact. Jasmine's presence was inconvenient for the system. A black woman from Oak Cliff with a sharp tongue and a file full of evidence. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this arena. Not across from a Supreme Court justice. And that's exactly why she showed up. Not for the headlines, not even for the win. But to say in the face of robed silence, you are not above the truth, no matter how high the bench you sit on. Inside the chamber, the air was heavy, not just with formality, but with the unmistakable weight of anticipation. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat with the serene authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime being listened to without question. Her hands rested lightly on the polished desk before her, her expression unreadable, but not unintentional. This was her arena. She'd been here before, in different forms, in different rooms. But this time was different. This time she wasn't answering questions about precedent or theory. She was here to defend herself. And yet she moved as if the entire hearing were beneath her consideration. When the chairwoman offered her the floor, Barrett rose with quiet confidence. The chamber, already silent, seemed to shrink into her voice. The role of a justice, she said, deliberate and measured, is to uphold the Constitution without bending to political pressure, no matter how loud or well-scripted it may appear. The room didn't breathe. The statement wasn't just a defense. It was a rebuke, a wall dressed in civility. Every phrase carried the unspoken assertion that she answered to history, not to politicians. Judicial independence, she continued, isn't a courtesy. It's a safeguard from the shifting winds of public opinion. There was no passion in her words, only cold certainty. She sat back down slowly, hands folded, gaze never drifting to the woman seated directly across from her. It was a silence designed not to ignore, but to erase. Then came the sound of a chair sliding across hardwood. Soft, controlled. Jasmine Crockett stood. Her movement wasn't abrupt, but it cut through the silence like a blade through still water. She didn't posture, didn't smile, didn't search the room for allies. Her focus was narrow, unwavering, and it landed squarely on Barrett. No papers in hand, no flourish in her voice, just clarity. Her presence in that moment wasn't defiant, it was earned. She had climbed here inch by inch, carrying the weight of every room she'd had to walk into with twice the proof and half the permission. And now she spoke. "Justice Barrett," she said, calm and exact, "are you aware that a family trust under your husband's name made multiple private investments in Croven Biotech between 2018 and 2021? The impact was immediate, not theatrical, not loud, but seismic. The tension didn't rise. It locked." Barrett blinked once, then with a voice colder than before answered, "I'm not here to be judged by someone who's never set foot on the bench of the nation's highest court." The words were crisp, but the intent was brutal. She hadn't denied the connection. She hadn't even addressed the question. Instead, she stripped it of legitimacy by attacking the woman who asked it. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The blow landed in a different way. Quiet, sharp, undeniable. It wasn't just professional condescension. It was the kind of dismissal Jasmine had heard her entire life, now delivered from the mouth of one of the most powerful judges in the nation. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink, because she'd come here expecting this. She'd known that standing across from a Supreme Court justice meant being treated as if she didn't belong. But Barrett's words weren't confirmation of Jasmine's inadequacy. They were confirmation of exactly what was wrong. And Jasmine, poised and waiting, wasn't offended. She was ready. Because when power shows you what it truly thinks of accountability, that's when you know the truth is close. Very close. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond to the insult. Not because it didn't cut, but because she knew something Justice Barrett didn't. Jasmine wasn't here for Barrett's approval. She was here for the truth. And the moment had arrived. Without a word, Jasmine reached into the folder in front of her. Deliberate, precise, like someone preparing to detonate something that couldn't be taken back. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it up without flair, just clarity. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice cool and unshaken, "that this is a transfer record of $3.1 million directed into a holding account belonging to Croven Biotech, originating from a financial trust registered under the name of Jesse Barrett." A beat of silence followed, but Jasmine wasn't done. "The trust transaction ID was anonymized, filed through a blind investment shell in the Cayman Islands. But we traced the trail back through layered fund managers. That trail ends in your household, Justice Barrett." The room turned heavy, like oxygen had thickened. Barrett didn't move, but her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She knew what this was now. It wasn't accusation, it was evidence. Jasmine placed the document on the table before her and slid it slightly forward. Just enough for the cameras to catch the heading. Just enough for history to record it. The reaction in the room was electric. Chairs shifted. Pens froze midair. Somewhere near the back row, a legal aide dropped a binder. No one reached down to pick it up. Barrett's attorneys leaned forward now, whispering fast, but Jasmine didn't turn toward them. Her eyes stayed on Barrett, unblinking, unwavering. "This transaction occurred less than 3 months before your written opinion on United States versus Croven Biotech, which effectively shielded them from a full-scale IRS audit," Jasmine continued. Her tone hadn't risen. That made it worse. This wasn't a speech. It was a surgical takedown, delivered without emotion because the facts were loud enough. And then came the pivot, the moment she stopped explaining and started indicting. "And yet, you ruled in favor of the defendant, citing lack of prosecutorial clarity while sitting on undisclosed financial proximity. That's not judicial independence. That's compromised ethics, wrapped in procedural language." The line didn't just land, it echoed. A full second passed before anyone dared exhale. Barrett hadn't said a word, but her silence now wasn't power, it was exposure. The air in the chamber had grown unbearably tight. Every breath felt like it had to ask permission to exist. The document Jasmine had laid bare, evidence of an undisclosed financial trail leading from Justice Barrett's household to Croven Biotech, had fractured the room's illusion of impartiality. And now all eyes turned to Barrett, not as a symbol, but as a subject. Her jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Then, with the kind of composure only the powerful are trained to master, she spoke. "I don't control my family's investment portfolio," she said, her voice even, untouched by shame or urgency. It was a line rehearsed and deployed with clinical precision. No hesitation, no emotion, no acknowledgement of what had just been shown. It wasn't a denial of the investment. It was a dismissal of responsibility. The kind of answer that doesn't seek to explain, only to escape. And for a split second, it worked. A few heads nodded faintly, almost involuntarily, reflexively accepting the language of power cloaked in technicality. But not Jasmine. Her voice cut through the stillness, low but unflinching. "Then tell me, Justice," she asked, her gaze never leaving Barrett's. "Did you control the decision you issued 2 weeks later that directly benefited Croven Biotech?" The effect was immediate. The question wasn't just sharp, it was surgical. It sliced through the insulation of legalese and financial fog and landed exactly where Barrett had hoped it wouldn't. On her judgment, on her agency. The answer about family investments could deflect. But this was different. This was about what she chose to write into law. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to, because what she had just asked wasn't rhetorical, it was radioactive. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was charged, electric, with anticipation and disbelief. A few seats behind the witness table, one of Barrett's legal advisors shifted forward, sensing that the tone of the hearing had changed for good. The hierarchy of the room, once unquestioned, was now unbalanced. And in that fragile pause, everyone watching understood. This was no longer about ethics paperwork. It was about trust and who had broken it. The silence after Jasmine's question hadn't dissipated. It had thickened, pressing down on every corner of the chamber like a coming storm. Justice Barrett had said nothing, not a breath, not a blink. And in that vacuum, something unspoken shifted. The presumption that this would be another exercise in polite deferral, another ritual where power protected itself behind a polished wall of precedent. But Jasmine hadn't come for politeness. She had come for the truth. And now she had the floor and the facts. Slowly, with a calm that masked the fire building beneath, she reached for a bound folder on the table. Her fingers moved with surgical care, not for dramatic flair, but with the purpose of someone who understood the weight of every word she was about to deliver. Then she spoke, not to fill the silence, but to cut through it. "In light of prosecutorial ambiguity and excessive punitive scope," she began, reading each word with crisp precision, "the court finds the federal tax investigation into Croven Biotech lacks constitutional merit, and therefore the penalty shall be vacated." Her voice didn't rise, but the impact was seismic. She paused, not for effect, but for gravity. "Total relief granted, $4.7 billion. The number landed like a punch. It wasn't just money, it was accountability, erased with the stroke of a pen. Jasmine turned the page, her tone steady, unflinching. "Furthermore, the IRS is hereby enjoined from pursuing continued forensic review of Croven Biotech's offshore accounts pending legislative reauthorization." Another pause. Then she added, quieter but sharper, "This wasn't judicial caution. This was a velvet shield, and someone made sure it was delivered on time." Her eyes never left the document, but the entire room could feel the temperature drop. She wasn't accusing anymore. She was unveiling. With measured motion, Jasmine set the ruling down, reached to her right, and picked up a small black remote. There was no announcement, no warning, just a simple press of her thumb. A flat screen behind her flickered to life. The audio was raw, unedited, a scratch of static, then a man's voice, smooth, confident, detached. "Barrett won't be a problem," he said. "We have a way to handle her. It's already in motion." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were damning in their casualness. There was no date attached, no names confirmed. But the meaning was unmistakable. Jasmine didn't turn to the screen. She didn't offer commentary. She didn't need to. She simply stepped aside and let the sound settle like smoke across the room. It wasn't just evidence. It was insight into a system where trust had long since rotted beneath the surface. Barrett didn't speak. Her body remained still, but not untouched. Her face, once composed in icy certainty, had lost its color. Her fingers, once folded in perfect form, curled slightly against the edge of the table. She blinked once, then again, as if trying to reset her mind. But the room had already seen it. The change, the fracture, the unmistakable moment when power loses its grip on the illusion of control. For the first time in her tenure as a justice, Amy Coney Barrett wasn't the one defining the narrative. She was at the center of it, and Jasmine Crockett, who had been labeled too loud, too bold, too unqualified by the very systems that protected women like Barrett, now stood silently as the facts did the speaking. No need to raise her voice. The truth was doing enough damage on its own. The silence that followed the audio recording wasn't empty. It pulsed, dense with implication, the kind that rearranged the air in the room. The words, "Barrett won't be a problem, we have a way to handle her," had settled not as an accusation, but as an echo of something rotten and long embedded. Every person seated in that chamber, senators, staffers, reporters, even the few remaining spectators, knew they had just heard something that would not disappear. And yet the one person who had not reacted until now was the one person under the most scrutiny. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat still for a beat longer, as though weighing not just a response, but how much of herself to expose. Then she drew in a controlled breath and responded with all the cold restraint of someone who had spent a lifetime cloaked in institutional immunity. "This is an affront to judicial independence," she said, her voice unwavering, each word enunciated with the deliberate control of someone reclaiming territory. "I refuse to answer hostile and unprofessional questions." The statement, though calm in delivery, was a rebuke sharpened to wound. It wasn't meant to defend, it was meant to silence, meant to remind the room that robes still carried weight, that power still belonged to those who sat above questioning. It was the kind of declaration that assumed history would continue to bend around status. But it landed differently this time, not as authority, but as resistance, a refusal to engage with the gravity of what had just been revealed. Jasmine stood across from her, unmoved. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, not to intimidate, but to make clear that Barrett's tone would not dictate the terms of accountability. When Jasmine finally did speak, it wasn't with anger. It was with something more dangerous: composure. "I'm not here to be liked," she said plainly. "I'm here to ask what the people have a right to know." The line sliced through the chamber's tension with a clean finality. It was not a performance. It was a mission statement, and it came not from defiance, but from clarity. Jasmine's hands didn't shake as she reached into her binder. She pulled out a printed email, unredacted, time-stamped, flagged by an investigative subcommittee just 48 hours prior. Holding it carefully, she raised it just high enough for the cameras to catch the bolded subject line: "SCOTUS strategy, priority." Her voice remained even as she continued. "This is an internal email from Croven Biotech's legal office. It was sent to a third-party intermediary, someone with deep ties to the Supreme Court. Their words, not mine." She paused, not for drama, but for emphasis. This wasn't speculative. This was documented. This was real. The kind of detail no amount of judicial dignity could dismiss. Then she read aloud: "We believe the matter will be resolved quietly through a channel we've used before. We've been assured that discretion is understood." The room shifted again. You could feel it. In the motionless bodies, in the scribbling pens, in the darting eyes of Barrett's legal team. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves, not in volume, but in substance. They revealed a quiet system behind the system, one in which rulings could be predicted and perhaps even counted on when the right strings were pulled. She set the email down, face up on the desk in front of her. Then she looked back at Barrett, not with anger, but with expectation. Because at this point, the only thing left that hadn't spoken was her. The email had done its job, not just as evidence, but as a scalpel. It sliced open the illusion that power still respected its own boundaries. Yet as damning as the words on that page had been, Jasmine knew the real disease lay deeper, far beneath the surface of this single case. Corruption, she understood, didn't always look like envelopes of cash or whispered threats. Sometimes it looked like consistency breaking apart when money entered the room. And so, as the chamber sat in stunned silence, processing the casual confidence of Croven Biotech's legal team in their ability to handle a sitting Supreme Court justice. Jasmine didn't let the moment settle. She pushed it further. She leaned forward, not as a politician, not even as an accuser, but as a woman with receipts. This isn't the first time you've ruled on a case involving tax liability and prosecutorial scope, she said, her voice even, not accusing but cutting. Let's rewind. United States vs. Gulf Horizon Foundation, 2017. The name alone carried little meaning to the room, but as the screen behind her lit up with excerpts from the ruling, the temperature shifted again. This wasn't drama. This was documentation. A case long buried in judicial memory, now pulled to the surface under an unforgiving light. Jasmine didn't blink. You wrote the dissent, she continued, arguing that the IRS had every right to pursue penalties even when procedural errors occurred, because, and I quote, no administrative flaw should shield willful evasion. The quote hung in the air like a ghost, cold, perfectly worded, and now uncomfortably contradictory. She gave the room a moment to absorb it. Then more quietly, she added, that foundation had a budget of $400,000. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The contrast was clear. A tiny nonprofit run out of a converted warehouse in Cincinnati had made clerical mistakes in filing its federal taxes. There had been no offshore accounts, no lobbying firms, no third-party intermediaries with ties to the court. But they had still been crushed, utterly and without pause. Barrett, in that ruling, had called their errors strategically negligent and voted to uphold the full financial penalties. It had been, according to her own written opinion, a matter of principle. Jasmine let the word principle rest between them. She didn't need to ask if Barrett remembered the case. She knew she did. Judges don't forget the things they write, especially not when those things are later used against them. They didn't have lobbyists, Jasmine said. They didn't have offshore accounts, and they sure didn't have access to discretion. The word came again, soft but devastating. Not shouted, not dramatized, just delivered, like a quiet knife placed exactly where it needed to go. Her voice wasn't filled with outrage. It was filled with something sharper, clarity. She had seen this pattern before, not just in Barrett's court, but across the system. Justice for the well-connected, punishment for the vulnerable. And Jasmine, standing where she was, understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of that equation. She had lived it. She stepped away from the microphone, not to retreat, but to shift the ground beneath them. She moved to the center of the chamber floor, drawing no attention to the motion, just letting her presence fill the space like a truth that refused to sit quietly anymore. Then she looked straight at Barrett and asked, if law is justice, why does money change how it moves? The question wasn't rhetorical, it wasn't political, it was moral, and it landed like a stone dropped into glass. The chamber didn't gasp. It didn't need to. It froze. The type of freeze that happens when something cuts too close, too true. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes locked onto Barrett's, not out of hostility, but insistence. This time the silence belonged to the one with the gavel. Barrett said nothing. Her mouth remained closed, her lips a flat, unreadable line. But her eyes, that carefully practiced shield of judicial detachment, faltered. They drifted, not in confidence, but in evasion. Not downward, not directly to Jasmine, but away. Toward no one. Toward nothing. It was the look of someone caught not in a lie, but in an inconsistency. And for someone like Barrett, who had built a career on precedent, on textual rigor, on the certainty of her own impartiality, that inconsistency was poison, the very core of her judicial identity, laid bare by a single question. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She let it breathe, let it turn heavy in the chest of everyone watching. Because in that stillness, something shifted in the room that went beyond scandal, beyond political rivalry. It was the recognition of a system that did not stumble. It selected, that punished without mercy when the defendant was poor, but found loopholes when the defendant was powerful. That claimed objectivity but functioned as hierarchy. Jasmine stood there, not triumphant, not angry, but resolute. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about revelation. The young staffers seated along the walls weren't scribbling anymore. Their pens had stilled. Even the senior senators, those long immune to drama, had gone quiet. Not because they didn't have questions, but because they finally had none left to ask. The comparison Jasmine had drawn was too stark, too direct, too close to what everyone suspected, but couldn't prove. Until now. She hadn't just exposed a conflict of interest. She had exposed a truth the institution had quietly lived with for years. That justice didn't always change with the law. It changed with the checkbook. Barrett's silence stretched longer than it should have. And the longer it stretched, the more it said. Jasmine didn't need a confession. She already had everything she needed. The ruling, the precedent, the contradiction, the email, the audio, and now, the silence. She turned her eyes back to her notes, not to retreat, but to reset. The fight wasn't over. But in this moment, she had done what so few ever dared. She made power look at itself and flinch. The silence left in the wake of Jasmine's final question was no longer the silence of reflection. It was the kind that arrived just before a structure collapsed. Barrett's gaze had gone blank, her previously composed posture now just a stillness that felt like evasion. The weight of contradiction was already heavy in the room, but the committee wasn't done. Jasmine wasn't done. And the system, finally, was no longer in control of the story. That's when the shift came. Quiet, subtle, but electric. The chair of the committee leaned forward slightly, her voice level but loaded with subtext. "The committee will now hear from our second scheduled witness," she said, eyes briefly scanning her notes. A few people in the press gallery looked up, confused. No secondary witness had been publicly listed. Then from the side entrance behind the main floor, a door opened. Every camera pivoted in unison. A man stepped through, not old, not confident, not part of any political machinery. He looked like someone who hadn't planned to be there. He adjusted his collar, stepped forward with careful but reluctant steps, and approached the witness table. The clerk announced his name, Daniel Levinson. His title, former legal assistant to Justice Amy Coney Barrett. A wave rippled across the room. Not dramatic, but definite. Reporters whispered into mics. Staffers leaned forward. Barrett turned slowly toward him, her expression unreadable. Jasmine remained motionless. She had known this was coming. She hadn't needed to say his name. She had only needed to let the truth get close enough to speak for itself. Levinson raised his right hand. The oath was standard. But nothing about this moment was. He sat down, folded his hands once, then again. His breath shook a little when he spoke. The chairwoman began the procedural introduction, asking his name, his background, and the dates of his service. Then she deferred to Congresswoman Crockett. Jasmine stood, not aggressive, not triumphant, just focused. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Levinson," she began, her tone sharp but not unkind. "During your time as a law clerk, were you ever instructed to destroy internal communications related to Justice Barrett's unofficial contacts with representatives of Croven Biotech?" The question dropped like a stone into water that had already gone still. Every person in the room sat upright. Levinson's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down. His jaw tensed, and for a moment it looked as if he might say nothing. But then he nodded. "Yes," he said. The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It fell flat and final, like a match dropped in a dry field. The reaction was instant, yet silent. No one gasped, no one moved. The temperature in the room dropped a degree. Jasmine kept her voice low. "Please elaborate," she said. Levinson swallowed hard. "It was never formal," he began, "but I was told the records were informal, outside the official docket. Notes, meeting summaries, calendar references. I was told they might be misinterpreted if they were seen outside the context of internal communication." His hands clenched on the table. He wasn't speaking like someone delivering a practice speech. He was speaking like someone unburdening something he had carried too long. "I was instructed to delete several email chains between chambers and an individual identified only as a consultant for Croven. I was also instructed to shred printed notes that referenced private meetings that, to my knowledge, were never disclosed on official records." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. She let him keep going. Levinson looked down. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to. I told myself it was normal, that maybe I just didn't understand how things worked at that level. But I knew it was wrong. I knew it crossed a line. And when I hesitated, I was told by a senior aide that it was part of protecting the justice's credibility. That if I truly believed in the work, I'd understand what needed to be kept clean. His voice cracked at that last word, clean, as if even saying it left something soiled. No one spoke, not even the senators who usually loved the spotlight. This wasn't politics anymore. This was complicity, laid bare by someone who'd once been trusted to keep things quiet. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone now quieter than ever, but so precise it felt louder than a shout. Just to clarify for the record, she said, you were instructed to destroy material, emails and printed notes, that involved Justice Barrett's unrecorded interactions with individuals representing Croven Biotech while she was sitting on a case that directly impacted their financial liability. Levinson nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said. That's correct. There it was, on record, under oath. Barrett didn't speak. She didn't object. She didn't even look at him. Her face had become a statue, motionless, unreadable. But the stillness wasn't control. It was collapse. Something in her eyes had faded, and whatever practiced composure she'd worn until now, it was cracking at the edges. She knew what had just happened. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't an insinuation. It was a confession, not hers, but one that pointed directly to her chambers. And in Washington, that was enough to start a storm that no black robe could stop. The chairwoman sat back slightly in her seat, her hands clasped tight on the desk before her. She glanced to her right. No one on the panel spoke. Jasmine didn't move. Levinson was still trembling, as if the act of speaking had taken more than he'd anticipated. And then finally the gavel, a single hollow strike. This committee will recess for 10 minutes, the chairwoman said, her voice hushed but resolute. No one stood, no one left. Even the cameras didn't pull away, because the room was no longer watching a hearing. It was watching a line being crossed, one that, until now, most people believed could never be touched. The Supreme Court had always existed behind walls, of tradition, of language, of presumed honor. But Jasmine had walked through those walls, and now the air inside them had turned cold, and very, very real. The silence left in the wake of Jasmine's final question was no longer the silence of reflection. It was the kind that arrived just before a structure collapsed. Barrett's gaze had gone blank, her previously composed posture now just a stillness that felt like evasion. The weight of contradiction was already heavy in the room, but the committee wasn't done. Jasmine wasn't done, and the system, finally, was no longer in control of the story. That's when the shift came. Quiet, subtle, but electric. The chair of the committee leaned forward slightly, her voice level but loaded with subtext. The committee will now hear from our second scheduled witness, she said, eyes briefly scanning her notes. A few people in the press gallery looked up, confused. No secondary witness had been publicly listed. Then, from the side entrance behind the main floor, a door opened. Every camera pivoted in unison. A man stepped through. Not old, not confident, not part of any political machinery. He looked like someone who hadn't planned to be there. He adjusted his collar, stepped forward with careful but reluctant steps, and approached the witness table. The clerk announced his name, Daniel Levinson. His title, former legal assistant to Justice Amy Coney Barrett. A wave rippled across the room, not dramatic but definite. Reporters whispered into mics. Staffers leaned forward. Barrett turned slowly toward him, her expression unreadable. Jasmine remained motionless. She had known this was coming. She hadn't needed to say his name. She had only needed to let the truth get close enough to speak for itself. Levinson raised his right hand. The oath was standard, but nothing about this moment was. He sat down, folded his hands once, then again. His breath shook a little when he spoke. The chairwoman began the procedural introduction, asking his name, his background, and the dates of his service. Then she deferred to Congresswoman Crockett. Jasmine stood, not aggressive, not triumphant, just focused. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Levinson," she began, her tone sharp but not unkind. "During your time as a law clerk, were you ever instructed to destroy internal communications related to Justice Barrett's unofficial contacts with representatives of Croven Biotech?" The question dropped like a stone into water that had already gone still. Every person in the room sat upright. Levinson's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked down. His jaw tensed, and for a moment, it looked as if he might say nothing. But then, he nodded. "Yes," he said. The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It fell flat and final, like a match dropped in a dry field. The reaction was instant, yet silent. No one gasped, no one moved. The temperature in the room dropped a degree. Jasmine kept her voice low. "Please elaborate," she said. Levinson swallowed hard. "It was never formal," he began, "but I was told the records were informal, outside the official docket. Notes, meeting summaries, calendar references. I was told they might be misinterpreted if they were seen outside the context of internal communication." His hands clenched on the table. He wasn't speaking like someone delivering a practice speech. He was speaking like someone unburdening something he had carried too long. "I was instructed to delete several email chains between chambers and an individual identified only as a consultant for Croven. I was also instructed to shred printed notes that referenced private meetings that, to my knowledge, were never disclosed on official records." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. She let him keep going. Levinson looked down. "I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to. I told myself it was normal, that maybe I just didn't understand how things worked at that level. But I knew it was wrong. I knew it crossed a line. And when I hesitated, I was told by a senior aide that it was part of protecting the justice's credibility. That if I truly believed in the work, I'd understand what needed to be kept clean." His voice cracked at that last word, clean, as if even saying it left something soiled. No one spoke, not even the senators who usually loved the spotlight. This wasn't politics anymore. This was complicity, laid bare by someone who'd once been trusted to keep things quiet. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone now quieter than ever, but so precise it felt louder than a shout. "Just to clarify for the record," she said, "you were instructed to destroy material, emails and printed notes, that involved Justice Barrett's unrecorded interactions with individuals representing Croven Biotech while she was sitting on a case that directly impacted their financial liability?" Levinson nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's correct." There it was, on record, under oath. Barrett didn't speak. She didn't object. She didn't even look at him. Her face had become a statue, motionless, unreadable. But the stillness wasn't control, it was collapse. Something in her eyes had faded, and whatever practiced composure she'd worn until now, it was cracking at the edges. She knew what had just happened. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't an insinuation. It was a confession. Not hers, but one that pointed directly to her chambers. And in Washington, that was enough to start a storm that no black robe could stop. The chairwoman sat back slightly in her seat, her hands clasped tight on the desk before her. She glanced to her right. No one on the panel spoke. Jasmine didn't move. Levinson was still trembling, as if the act of speaking had taken more than he'd anticipated. And then finally the gavel, a single hollow strike. "This committee will recess for 10 minutes, the chairwoman said, her voice hushed but resolute. No one stood. No one left. Even the cameras didn't pull away, because the room was no longer watching a hearing. It was watching a line being crossed, one that, until now, most people believed could never be touched. The Supreme Court had always existed behind walls, of tradition, of language, of presumed honor. But Jasmine had walked through those walls, and now the air inside them had turned cold, and very, very real. The 10-minute recess felt like a lifetime suspended in air. Senators whispered behind closed doors. Reporters filed half-finished leads they knew would be obsolete in minutes. Staffers exchanged glances, tight-lipped, unable to make sense of what had just unfolded. The hearing room itself remained mostly full, but the energy had shifted from tension to something closer to awe. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. They were no longer witnessing political theater. They were watching the very idea of judicial invincibility begin to fracture. And in the middle of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat alone at her desk, reviewing the same set of papers she had walked in with. No dramatic pacing, no self-congratulation, just quiet readiness. The kind of readiness born from years of being told she didn't belong in places like this. Only to stand there, over and over, anyway. When the gavel struck again, signaling the end of the recess, the room refilled with heavy footsteps and weighted silence. Barrett had returned to her seat, but something in her posture had changed. Her back was still straight, but it was no longer defiant. It was defensive. She didn't speak, didn't look around. Her hands were folded, but her fingers tapped rhythmically, a subconscious tick that betrayed the calm she was trying to project. Then Jasmine stood. No flourish, no grandstanding, just a slow, steady rise. She walked toward the microphone with the deliberate pace of someone who knew that every step counted now. And as she arrived at the podium, she didn't look at her notes. She looked directly at the woman across from her. "I'm not standing here to destroy you, Justice Barrett," Jasmine said, her voice low, level, and piercing. "I'm standing here to restore the trust you once held in your hands." And dropped. The words weren't delivered with anger. They didn't need to be. Because truth, when spoken plainly, has a weight that no volume can match. The room didn't breathe. There was no murmuring, no side chatter. Every sound had evacuated the space, leaving only the clarity of that moment. Jasmine wasn't just confronting a judge. She was confronting a system that had convinced itself it could never be held accountable. And she was doing it with nothing more than calm conviction and a microphone. Barrett didn't respond. Not because she chose not to, but because there was nothing left to say. Her face, once an expressionless mask, now bore the faint tension of someone trying, and failing, to contain the panic behind their eyes. The people who had once insulated her from public consequences were no longer in control. The architecture of her immunity had cracked, and through that opening, truth had poured in like floodlight. Then came the sound. Quiet, methodical footsteps at the back of the chamber. Two men entered, no announcement, no warning, just the presence of power that didn't need introduction. Their suits were dark, identical, their expressions unreadable. One held a slim manila envelope. The other scanned the room with eyes that had been trained to look past emotion and focus only on precision. The seal stitched into their jackets said everything that needed to be said. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, the room didn't know whether to move or freeze, so it did both. Half the audience leaned forward. The rest held their breath. The agents approached the front with the kind of calm you only learn from years of delivering news that changes lives. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. As they reached the bench where Barrett sat, the agent holding the envelope leaned forward and placed it gently, almost respectfully, on the table before her. Then he spoke, his voice clear but soft enough not to echo. "Justice Barrett," he said, "you are being served a formal subpoena for all records, correspondence, and internal documents relating to Crovan Biotech and its representatives." Barrett didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't even look at it. Her hands remained frozen on the desk, as if acknowledging the paper would give it more weight than it already carried. But everyone else in the room saw it for what it was. The collapse of a wall long thought untouchable. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply watched. Not as a victor, but as someone who had fought too many quiet battles to confuse accountability with vengeance. The line she had spoken only moments earlier still hung in the air. "I'm standing here to restore the trust you once held in your hands," and dropped. And now, as the subpoena sat silently between them, the truth of those words had never felt more visible. One of the agents remained beside the bench. The other stepped back, allowing a respectful distance but maintaining presence. Barrett finally moved, not to speak, but to place one trembling hand over the envelope. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She wasn't being arrested, not yet, but the illusion that she was above the rules had just shattered, and everyone in the room had watched it happen. The chairwoman cleared her throat, her voice measured but strained. This committee acknowledges the service of the subpoena, she said. Proceedings will continue after documentation is reviewed and counsel is consulted. Another gavel, another breath no one had realized they were holding, and still Jasmine remained at the microphone, silent now, but unshakably present. Not to celebrate, not to punish, but to bear witness. Because in that room, under the carved ceilings of American power, something had finally happened that was rarely allowed. A question had been asked by someone who wasn't supposed to ask it, and the system had been forced to answer. The subpoena lay before her like a verdict carved in silence. The entire chamber had frozen in time, suspended between disbelief and inevitability. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the manila envelope, as if by refusing to touch it she could delay what it represented. Accountability, delivered not by gavel or robe, but by process, plain and federal. The FBI agent beside her didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The silence was no longer hers to command. Every camera in the room had closed in. Every microphone had sharpened its ears. And still, Jasmine Crockett stood firm at the microphone, not speaking, not gesturing, simply present, like a truth no longer willing to be ignored. Finally, Barrett reached forward. Slowly. Her hand hovered for a moment, then pressed against the envelope's edge. She opened it without ceremony, her fingers moving with the stiff motion of someone forcing their body through a moment their mind had not prepared for. She pulled the document halfway from its sleeve, glanced at the bolded title, Subpoena for Testimony and Production of Documents, Federal Investigation 32-104/Croven Biotech, and then, without looking up, picked up the pen that had been resting near her nameplate. With deliberate control, she signed. Her handwriting was small, sharp, and careful. Every stroke seemed like a negotiation with what little control she still had left. Then she set the pen down. Her hand remained on the desk, trembling just slightly. Her voice when it came was quiet, but not soft. It was the voice of someone still clinging to the belief that her title meant she could define reality. "It's absurd," she said under her breath, though loud enough to be picked up by the mics. A congresswoman from Texas thinking she can put the Supreme Court on trial. She didn't look at Jasmine when she said it. She didn't need to. The insult was meant to land like a whip, dismissive, elegant, surgical. The kind of line that belonged in memoirs written by people who never imagined they'd be questioned. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't tilt her head. She didn't even blink. She waited, let the weight of the remark settle into the room like dust kicked from an old statue. Then, with a calm that was almost unnerving, she stepped once more toward the mic. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply cut clean. "I'm not putting power on trial," she said. "I'm asking questions, on behalf of the people that power is supposed to serve." There was no applause, no murmurs, just silence, pure silence, as her words echoed in every corner of the room, settling deep in the cracks of tradition, like water under stone. Barrett's expression barely moved, but her eyes betrayed something she hadn't shown before. Recognition. Not defeat, not fear, but the dawning realization that for the first time in her public life, she no longer controlled the narrative. The room didn't shift. It didn't erupt. It absorbed. Jasmine's words weren't a climax. They were a recalibration, a redefinition of who had the right to speak and what kind of truth deserved to be heard. The gavel hadn't fallen yet. The investigation had only just begun. But in that moment, something sacred had broken open, and what spilled out was not chaos, but clarity, not vengeance, but justice with a steady voice and a Texas accent that refused to ask for permission. The chamber had returned to stillness, but the country had not. As the subpoena was signed and the words left Jasmine Crockett's mouth, a current began to hum beneath the surface of American consciousness. Quiet at first, then building, until it surged into the bloodstream of every screen, every scroll, every shared moment of digital resistance. That hearing had ended, but the footage, the confrontation, the stillness in Barrett's eyes as she looked down at her own signature, had already escaped the room. By the time the committee dismissed, the internet had already turned Jasmine's defiance into a rallying cry. Within hours, clips from the hearing were everywhere. On cable news, the footage played on a loop, each network coloring it with their own narrative. But none could erase the power of what had happened. On social media, the video of Jasmine calmly stating, "I'm not putting power on trial. I'm asking questions on behalf of the people that power is supposed to serve," exploded across timelines. It wasn't just trending, it was being dissected, subtitled, translated. A 6-second clip of Barrett looking down at the subpoena had been set to slow motion and paired with audio of breaking glass. TikTok edits turned Jasmine into a symbol of what accountability could look like when spoken without fear. Millions weren't just watching, they were remembering. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the impact arrived like thunder rolling through the walls of a public school classroom. At Lincoln High, in a second-floor civics class, the lights dimmed and a projector clicked to life. The class, usually sluggish after lunch, sat straighter than usual. On screen, Jasmine appeared, not as a politician, but as something far rarer, a citizen who didn't ask for permission to speak truth to power. Her voice rang through the speakers, calm and precise. "I'm not standing here to destroy you, Justice Barrett. I'm standing here to restore the trust you once held in your hands," and dropped. The classroom didn't move. At the front, Miss Darnell, a teacher who had spent most of her 20-year career explaining the Constitution to students who often felt alienated by it, turned to face the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This," she said, pointing back to the screen, "is what it looks like when a citizen protects the Constitution. Not with slogans, but with questions. Not with power, but with courage." Her students, many of them first-generation Americans, watched with a kind of silent reverence. They had seen protests, speeches, hashtags. But this was someone who walked into the highest room in the land, faced someone no one ever dared confront, and stood firm. One student, David, raised his hand slowly. "She wasn't even yelling," he said. "She just stood there." Another nodded, and the judge didn't have anything to say back. Ms. Darnell smiled, not because of Jasmine's victory, but because of what her students were seeing for the first time. That strength doesn't always come from volume. It comes from clarity, from showing up when every part of the system hopes you'll stay home, from asking a question so honest that the only response left is silence. The hearing had ended in Washington, but in classrooms, living rooms, church basements, and veterans' halls across America, Jasmine Crockett had become something larger than the moment that birthed her courage. Not an icon, not a politician, but a reminder that the Constitution isn't defended by robes or rituals, but by people bold enough to ask, "Why does justice move when money speaks?" And then brave enough to wait for an answer. The news cycle should have swallowed her whole. By every metric of modern media, Jasmine Crockett had just become the most wanted woman in America. After confronting a sitting Supreme Court justice with documented evidence, holding her gaze as agents from the FBI served a subpoena, and walking away without raising her voice, she had done what almost no one had dared, and the world took notice. Not just Washington, not just Twitter, the world. Producers scrambled. Every major network reached out within hours of the hearing's end. CNN offered her an entire Sunday block. MSNBC's primetime anchor said, "Name your time, we'll clear the hour." Even international outlets, from the BBC to Al Jazeera, sent formal interview requests. "She is," one strategist tweeted, "the calm America didn't know it needed." Op-eds poured in. Commentators called her a masterclass in restraint. Meme accounts clipped her words onto black backgrounds. "I'm not putting power on trial. I'm asking questions on behalf of the people that power is supposed to serve." Her line about restoring trust trended globally. And yet, amid the rising heat of public admiration and partisan curiosity, Jasmine Crockett vanished. No interviews, no press conference, not even a single social media post. She ignored her phone for 36 hours straight, despite texts from fellow members of Congress, former law professors, civil rights legends, and even a direct message from the president's chief of staff. Her assistant left a dozen voicemails marked urgent. Booking agents camped outside her office door like reporters chasing a runaway witness. But Jasmine didn't budge. She broke her silence only once, and she did so with the same measured intensity that had defined her entire confrontation with Barrett. A one-sentence statement sent to every news desk in the country. It didn't come through a flashy press release or video announcement. No signature, no slogan. Just a line written in black ink and sent by email. Truth doesn't need a microphone. It needs someone brave enough to say it when the room goes quiet. That was it. And somehow it said everything. Cable anchors read it aloud like scripture. Newspapers reprinted it in bold above fold. On TikTok, users recited it over piano music and clips of her courtroom stare. It appeared on murals, stickers, protest signs. The New Yorker ran a full-page editorial just unpacking the subtext of her sentence. One analyst said, "She's not rejecting attention. She's redefining it." But Jasmine didn't write the line for branding. She wrote it because she meant it. The day after the hearing, while television hosts debated the constitutional implications of Barrett's subpoena, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office on Capitol Hill. Lights dimmed, door closed. The headlines were thundering outside, but inside, there was only paper. Folders stacked to the ceiling, scanned audits, procurement records, testimonies from whistleblowers who'd begged to be heard. She didn't spend the afternoon watching replays of her moment. She spent it going line by line through an Inspector General's report on misappropriated federal education funds. In the margins, she wrote annotations in red pen. She circled clauses, underlined vendors, and highlighted emails from a network of shell companies. Companies that had promised classroom tech to underfunded school districts and delivered nothing but debt. No one was watching this part, and that's why she did it. This was Jasmine's rhythm, her resistance. She didn't care about trending. She cared about trackable money, where it went, who took it, and why students in East Texas were still reading from books older than their teachers. While news cycles speculated about Barrett's fate, Jasmine was already preparing for her next oversight hearing. Federal waste in Title I and school programs. It wasn't glamorous. It wouldn't go viral. But it was where the harm lived, quiet, hidden, unanswered. She leaned back in her chair only once that night, rubbing the bridge of her nose, exhaustion creeping through her jaw. She hadn't slept more than a few hours. The adrenaline of the hearing had long faded. What remained wasn't satisfaction, but weight. The weight of knowing how many more rooms she'd have to walk into. How many more people would call her too ambitious, too confrontational, or too loud, just for asking questions no one wanted to answer. Her assistant knocked quietly. "There's another 5 interview requests," she said, "and a package from The Tonight Show. They're offering a tribute segment. You're getting compared to Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm." Jasmine didn't look up. She flipped another page in the audit report and said, "Tell them no, all of them." The assistant paused. "They said it could help your image." Jasmine finally looked up, tired but unshaken. "The truth doesn't need an image. It needs endurance." She said it not as a performance, but as a principle. She didn't need to prove she was serious. She needed to keep working. Elsewhere across the country, her silence spoke louder than words. Students in Milwaukee were still discussing her courtroom clip. College debate teams analyzed her calm under pressure. A community center in Newark started a workshop on asking the questions that matter, centered on Jasmine's hearing. Teachers wrote her name in lesson plans. High schoolers quoted her in essays. Not because she had crafted a brand, but because she hadn't. Her refusal to cash in on the moment became, paradoxically, the moment itself. In Baltimore, a mother of 3 left a voicemail for Jasmine's office after watching the hearing replay late at night. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I don't know what you'll do next. I just want you to know. I felt like you were finally speaking for someone like me." In Kansas City, a man who had voted against Jasmine's party his entire life sent a handwritten letter admitting, "I didn't agree with you politically, I still don't. But when you stood there and didn't blink, that did something." She would never read those words on a screen. They weren't headlines, but they were something rarer. They were reminders that the work she did didn't end with a televised confrontation. It began with it. And the real victories, if they ever came, would come quietly, in policy changes, in budget reallocations, in exposing the next invisible abuse that the cameras wouldn't chase. Jasmine didn't need the lights. She needed the documents, the witnesses, the staffers ready to dig when the press moved on. So when the next Monday rolled around, Jasmine Crockett entered room 302 of the Oversight Committee with a fresh stack of files under her arm. No cameras, no applause, just another hearing, another table, another silence that needed someone to speak into it. Because this was never about microphones. It was about being the voice that doesn't wait for permission. And Jasmine Crockett would be that voice again, and again, and again. But as Jasmine Crockett disappeared into the work no one televised, a deeper truth lingered, one that outlived the headlines, outshined the viral edits, and outlasted even the silence that followed her final words. Because beneath the subpoenas and confrontation, beneath the viral phrases and folded documents, something more enduring had been laid bare, a moral reckoning. It wasn't just about holding one powerful person accountable. It was about what we, citizens, students, lawmakers, bystanders, do when the institutions we depend on stop depending on integrity. Jasmine had walked into that chamber alone, armed not with power but with principle. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something it had been taught to forget, that courage doesn't roar. It stands quietly, especially when everyone else sits. Her lesson was not wrapped in political theater. It was buried in contradiction, the kind where people with power demand to be trusted while hiding from transparency. The kind where robes are used like armor, not symbols of justice. Jasmine didn't speak because she wanted to dismantle the system. She spoke because the people beneath it had been crushed by its weight for too long. She didn't destroy anything. She revealed what had already been broken. She showed that silence can be more violent than speech, and that sometimes asking a question is the most radical act of patriotism a person can make. The courtroom wasn't her battlefield. Truth was, and she didn't fight it with fury. She fought it with patience, with calm, with unshakable purpose. The lesson Jasmine left behind wasn't for pundits. It wasn't for headlines. It was for anyone who had ever been told, "This room isn't yours." For the girl in the back of a civics class who thinks her voice won't matter. For the veteran who feels abandoned by the very Constitution he once swore to protect. For the teacher who believes education is sacred, but watches it be sold for contracts. Jasmine spoke for them, and in doing so, she taught something simple and profound. You do not need permission to protect what's right. You only need the will to stand up when it's easier to stay seated. But her story also carried a harder truth. One most people won't put on posters. That when you speak out, you will be targeted. That the system will first ignore you, then try to discredit you, then try to absorb you. That even when you win, you may never feel triumphant. Jasmine had faced down one of the highest judges in the land and walked out with her integrity intact, but not without scars. The weight she carried afterward wasn't glory. It was the burden of knowing how many more rooms she'd have to enter, alone, to keep the truth alive. Her strength wasn't in the moment itself. It was in her decision to return to the work after it was over, unseen, uncelebrated, but necessary. That's the human message in Jasmine's story. That justice isn't some final destination. It's a fight that keeps happening every day, in quiet halls and overlooked files. That bravery doesn't always mean speaking louder. It often means standing longer. That real change doesn't begin with noise. It begins with clarity, with one person in the right moment saying, enough. Not because it's safe, not because it's easy, but because it's right. And when Jasmine Crockett stood in that hearing room, she didn't make herself the center of the story. She made truth the center and refused to move away from it. That is the lesson she left behind. That is what justice looks like. Not perfect, not popular, but present, relentlessly, quietly, and absolutely present. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. At a nationally televised debate in Arizona, Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller go head-to-head over America's broken immigration system. Miller tries to dominate the stage with fear, data, and fury, but just minutes later, Jasmine flips the narrative with undeniable documented proof. The entire room shifts, the momentum collapses, and reputations begin to crack under the weight of the truth. What was he hiding? And how did she expose it so fast? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Arizona air hung heavy with heat and tension as floodlights carved the CNN town hall stage into a national altar of reckoning. The banners read immigration, borders, and justice. But everyone in the room knew this was more than policy talk. It was a clash of ideologies, raw and personal. In the packed auditorium, the crowd simmered. 60% were hardline conservatives, arms crossed and brows furrowed, already convinced the system had failed them. 30% were human rights advocates and legal professionals, here to defend a version of America that still believed in dignity over division. The remaining 10% were independents, silent, skeptical, watching. On stage stood the embodiment of hard policy, Stephen Miller. Lean, pale, composed like a snake coiled in silence, his record on immigration had drawn praise from the far right and condemnation from nearly every civil liberties organization in the country. Facing him was Jasmine Crockett, the Texas congresswoman whose roots in civil rights law made her not just a challenger, but a disruptor. She wasn't here for applause. She was here to fight. The lighting crew dimmed the house lights. The audience leaned forward in their seats, and the opening cue blared through the speakers. Every camera was live. Every phone was rolling, and the country was about to witness a collision that no one would forget. Backstage, Jasmine adjusted the mic on her lapel while her chief of staff whispered updates in her ear. "Miller's going hard on asylum loopholes," he warned. She nodded once. No fear. She'd been underestimated before, many times. The moderators weren't allies and the format wasn't fair. But fairness had never been part of her path. What she carried wasn't just rebuttal, it was lived truth, sharpened and ready. As the countdown reached one, Jasmine stepped into the spotlight, not as a guest, but as a storm. The moment the cameras turned, it wasn't a debate stage anymore. It was a war zone, and she was ready to take fire. And then, with a subtle nod from the moderator and a sharp inhale from the audience, the silence broke, and Stephen Miller took the floor like a prosecutor entering the scene of a crime. He didn't storm the stage, he didn't shout, but there was something colder, more deliberate in his posture, like a man who came not to argue, but to indict. His hands folded loosely in front of him, his voice steady, calculated, every syllable weighed with the force of someone who believed he alone understood the true cost of mercy. "Let's stop pretending this is about compassion," he said, eyes scanning the crowd, tone flat as granite. "This is about control, or rather, the lack of it." That sentence hit like a hammer. The room held its breath. Behind him, the massive screen sparked to life. The footage began in grayscale, grainy and stark, overhead drone captures, time-stamped with dates from the past 6 months. The images showed figures moving in the dead of night, some sprinting between gaps in the fencing, others crawling under barbed wire, children hoisted over makeshift ladders by adult silhouettes. Miller didn't comment on these yet. The silence made them worse. The next clip switched to heat sensor imaging, bodies glowing white against the desert black, clustered behind brush, crouching in shadows, dozens at a time. Then came footage from fixed security towers, wide-angle shots of open desert trails, tire marks, discarded backpacks, and, finally, chaotic scenes at overwhelmed intake facilities, where border agents appeared outnumbered, disoriented, exhausted. Without breaking stride, Miller clicked forward to the data. First came the line graph, sharp spikes in encounters and detainments over the past year. Then pie charts of national origins, clusters labeled Central America, South Asia, North Africa. A bar graph of repeat crossings, a scatter plot of arrests tied to individuals with expired visas. The slides weren't neutral, they were crafted for drama. Red highlights, bold arrows, explosive percentages like a visual alarm bell. "These aren't isolated incidents," Miller said calmly, gesturing at the numbers. "This is systemic collapse." And he let that phrase linger. He turned slightly, letting the images speak before his voice cut through again. sharper now. "This is not immigration," he declared, every syllable deliberate, his finger stabbing at the numbers behind him. "This is invasion, and politicians like Representative Jasmine Crockett are cheering it on from the sidelines." The crowd erupted, cheers from one side, low growls from the other. But Jasmine sat still, a storm behind her eyes. She'd heard it before. She'd lived it before. But this was louder, more coordinated, a machine designed not to argue, but to crush. Miller pressed on, unrelenting. He clicked through another slide. Tables of arrest records tied to individuals flagged at entry points, with offenses ranging from drug possession to theft and assault. Another slide listed suspected gang affiliations, complete with blurred mugshots and foreign-sounding names. "Under the veil of humanitarianism," he said, now pacing the stage with a slow, predator's rhythm, "we have legalized chaos. Borders are broken, laws are ignored, and the American working class, the people in this room, are paying the price." The room shifted. Even those who hadn't clapped now leaned forward, uncertain where to place their allegiance in the rising tension. He turned toward Jasmine, not with rage, but with something colder, conviction devoid of empathy. "There are those who wear suits and smile into cameras while dismantling the very foundation of national security." He didn't need to name her. The cameras already had. His tone didn't waver. His face didn't move. And then came the final blow, his voice low, certain, undeniable in its theatrical cruelty. "If this continues, it won't just be a policy failure, it will be national suicide." The audience exploded. Cheers from conservatives, standing ovations from corners already sold on the fear he had conjured. But at the heart of the stage, Jasmine remained seated, her spine straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. But deep down, she knew what had just happened. This wasn't a policy debate. This was a setup, a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to bury her beneath a mountain of one-sided numbers, distorted images, and primal fear. What was worse than the lies was how familiar they sounded. The applause still echoed like gunfire when Jasmine finally moved. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't raise her hand or match the volume of Miller's crescendo. No, she chose stillness, a deliberate act of resistance in a room built for noise. The lights caught the faint shine of her necklace, a quiet symbol resting over her heart as if shielding it. She waited until the last clap died into awkward silence, until even the most loyal Miller supporter had to sit back down. Then with unshakable calm, she leaned forward, just slightly, just enough to draw the cameras closer. Her voice came not as a shout, but as a reckoning. Steady, intimate, impossible to ignore. "Stephen," she began, locking eyes with him across the stage, "do you believe that an immigrant is worth less than your own grandparents were?" The temperature in the room dropped. The tension shifted. The audience, so loud moments earlier, suddenly felt exposed, because it wasn't policy anymore. It was personal, director, unavoidable. The kind of question that grabs you by the collar and forces you to choose who you really are. She let the silence hang there for a beat too long. Long enough for every person watching to remember someone in their own family tree who once crossed an ocean or a desert or a line on a map with nothing but fear in their bones and hope in their hands. Then she spoke again, no louder, but with a gravity that made the air itself lean in. "Because I assure you," she said, her voice growing colder, sharper, "they bled the same. They fled hunger, violence, oppression, just like the people you've spent the last 10 minutes demonizing." Her posture remained composed, but her words cut with precision, exposing the double standard threaded into Miller's narrative. She wasn't defending policy. She was defending memory, bloodlines, the forgotten truth that every name once sounded foreign on someone's lips. She didn't stop there. She knew she had struck a nerve, and now she twisted, not cruelly, but with conviction. "The Constitution, our Constitution, was not written to protect bloodlines," she continued, her voice now aimed beyond the stage, beyond the studio, speaking directly to those watching in living rooms, classrooms, and border towns. "It was written to protect dignity. It doesn't ask where you were born. It asks whether you are treated with equal justice under the law." She paused, not for effect, but because the weight of those words deserved stillness. Her eyes scanned the audience, and for the first time since the broadcast began, even some of the conservative guests looked less certain, their applause now a distant memory. She let the last sentence hang in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire, her words still echoing across the walls of the hall. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, taut, charged like the breath before a storm breaks. And Jasmine, reading the room with the precision of someone who had lived her whole life under scrutiny, made her move. Her tone didn't rise. Her posture didn't change. But the atmosphere did. She turned deliberately, locking eyes with Miller, still standing near the screen of flickering heat sensor footage in aggressive red graphs, and unleashed the line that shifted the center of gravity in the room. Let's call it what it is. You're not showing evidence. You're selling fear. There was no dramatics in her delivery, only a steady, deadly calm that somehow cut deeper. You take fragments of truth, isolated incidents, raw numbers with no soul, and you frame them in a way that strips people of their humanity. That isn't analysis. That's emotional manipulation dressed up as policy. Her voice didn't waver, but it hardened. Each word was a scalpel, slicing into the core of the narrative Miller had spent years building. She turned briefly to gesture toward the massive screen behind him, still running its loop of shaky surveillance footage and weaponized statistics. You call it security, she said, her hand falling back to the podium. But it's theater. You light the fire and then offer yourself as the extinguisher. A pulse moved through the audience. A few people who had cheered minutes earlier now sat still, fingers resting on their chins, lips pressed into lines. From the left side of the room came a brief, uncertain clap. Twice, then silence. A woman in the middle row lowered her phone mid-recording. On the far right, a man shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of what had just been said. And that was the difference. Miller's argument had ignited them, yes, but Jasmine's was making them think. She wasn't trying to provoke emotion. She was revealing its use as a weapon. Jasmine stayed perfectly composed, but inside she felt the heat of every inch of ground she had to fight for just to reach this moment. She could feel the tension, how even now, in a room lit by cameras and claims of fairness, every word she spoke had to climb uphill, had to dodge the minefields of bias, the landmines of assumption. She wasn't just countering Miller's message. She was challenging a system that had, for decades, equated brown skin and an accent with danger. And still she spoke, clear, grounded, unapologetic, not because she expected to be applauded, but because someone in that room needed to hear the difference between facts and fear. The silence that followed Jasmine's powerful dismantling of Miller's fear-based data strategy hung in the air like a fragile truce. But Miller had never intended to leave the battlefield. His eyes flicked to the production team, a nearly imperceptible nod. And then, like a trap door opening beneath the stage, the mood collapsed. The giant screen behind him stuttered for a second, then flared into stark, grainy clarity. This wasn't a chart. This wasn't a graph. This was a weaponized moment, a leaked, never-before-seen piece of body cam footage, unpolished, unfiltered, and purposefully raw. Time-stamped in the bottom left, 2:13 a.m., 2 weeks prior. The location, a dimly lit gas station parking lot near El Paso. The footage wobbled as the officer jogged forward, camera bouncing with urgency. Flashing sirens painted the asphalt in rotating halos of blue and red. 2 officers moved in on a figure near the pumps. A young man, Hispanic, no more than 22, his hands raised above his head, his face streaked with sweat and fear. Within seconds, he was thrown to the ground, cuffed, and rolled onto his back. There was shouting, inaudible at first. Then the words from the officer came through, crisp, clinical. Suspect confirmed. Prior release, border parole, pending asylum status. The caption beneath the video froze, burned in white against the frame like a scar. Previously released under federal parole protocol, pending asylum interview. The room had gone still. No one looked at Miller. They stared at the boy, This unprepared, unnamed man, now cast as the embodiment of a national debate. No crime shown, no conviction rendered, just implication, just association. And that, Miller knew, was enough. He stepped forward, letting the silence metastasize. He didn't look at the screen, but past it, directly into Jasmine's eyes. Then with cold finality, he raised his arm and pointed. "Let me show you the real consequence," he said, stepping to the side like an attorney unveiling a smoking gun. "This is the policy you defend. This is the outcome." He took another step toward the audience, letting his voice swell with calculated anger. "He was released under your side's rules," he said, drawing out the word like a blade unsheathed. 2 weeks later, armed robbery, 3 victims, 1 still in the ICU. The audience erupted as if on cue. It didn't matter that the video offered no evidence of guilt. It didn't matter that parole protocols involved background checks and limited timelines. Miller had done what he came to do: fuse fear with imagery, wrap the narrative around a single body in handcuffs, and deliver it like a verdict. A man in the third row jumped up, his voice cracking from rage. "She's the reason this happened." Another scream from the balcony. "How do you sleep at night?" Applause cascaded over the stage like a flood breaching the dam. Phones rose into the air, screens flashing, capturing not just the image on the wall, but Jasmine's silence beneath it. The footage kept playing on a loop, zooming in on the young man's face as officers pushed him into the back of a squad car. No one asked about his name. No one cared if he had legal counsel. He was not a human being anymore. He was a prop, a projection of everything they were told to fear. And now that fear had a timestamp, a headline, a face, and behind it all, in the glare of the spotlight, Miller stood triumphant. And in that moment, Jasmine understood what she was up against. Not just a man with a microphone, but a machine that could turn a life into a soundbite, a grainy clip into a trial, and a courtroom of facts into a theater of rage. But just as the applause began to reach its fever pitch, Jasmine moved. Not with fire, but with precision. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble. She didn't reach for volume or drama the way others might have. Instead, she simply leaned forward in her chair, as if shifting the weight of truth back into her spine, and raised one hand toward the moderator's desk. Her fingers didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. "I'd like to respond," she said, measured, calm, and firm. Not seeking permission, but reclaiming space. The moderator hesitated for half a beat, caught between the rolling thunder of the crowd and the authority in Jasmine's tone. But she nodded. Jasmine didn't wait. She looked directly toward the control booth and gave a subtle, rehearsed cue. "Play Exhibit B, please." The room's energy shifted, not all at once, but like a wave hitting a seawall. Tension building, something about to break. The screen that had just moments earlier cast the silhouette of a handcuffed young man now flickered again. The image cut to black. The applause faded into silence. Confused, reluctant. Then a new video appeared. No police lights, no shaky body cam. Instead, a static shot of a county seal, followed by a modest, official chyron. Testimony. Sheriff Dalton Reyes, Cochise County. The image cleared to reveal a man behind a podium in a sparsely lit town hall. Sheriff Dalton Reyes, known in border state law enforcement circles as a straight-talking, by-the-book public servant. Not a partisan flamethrower, not someone easily manipulated. The footage came from a community forum just 2 months prior, streamed live but barely covered in mainstream headlines. Now it had a national audience. Reyes's voice, gravelly and lined with fatigue, filled the room. "We issued multiple notices to DHS, warning about cartel activity tied to parolees in our district." He paused, taking a visible breath in the video. "We asked for coordination. What we got was silence. Political silence." The room froze. The words political silence landed like a bell ringing in a courtroom. They weren't angry. They weren't sensational. They were exhausted. And that exhaustion, authentic, human, undeniable, said more than any graph ever could. On the stage, Jasmine didn't move. She let the testimony run for 5 more seconds, just long enough for Reyes to close with a line that didn't need shouting. "When policy gets filtered through politics, people bleed." Then she nodded again to the booth. and the screen cut to black. The silence that followed wasn't the same silence that Miller had conjured minutes earlier. That one had been performative, pregnant with staged outrage. This one was something else. It was dense, uncertain. It hung in the air not because people had agreed, but because now they weren't so sure. Jasmine didn't rush. She reached to her right and picked up a single sheet of paper that had been resting quietly on the table beside her water glass. No thick folder, no dramatic pull from a leather briefcase, just one document, prepared and waiting. She stood, not abruptly, but with purpose, and the room, sensing a shift, held its breath again. "This," she said, lifting the page with both hands so that every camera could catch it, "is an internal email from a federal liaison officer dated 3 months ago." She paused just long enough to let the weight of that introduction settle. She wasn't dropping bombs. She was detonating carefully placed charges. Her voice remained even, but now with the deliberate cadence of someone reading a verdict. She looked up, locked eyes with the front row, then read aloud, "We are not authorized to collaborate with state-level departments that are politically misaligned with the agency's leadership." That sentence didn't echo. It thudded. No one reacted at first. No gasps, no groans, no protests. Just the kind of silence that happens when people are recalculating, when certainty is cracked by something too clean, too direct to ignore. Jasmine folded the paper slowly, placed it flat on the table, and took one small step forward toward the edge of the stage. The cameras followed her like heat-seeking missiles. Her voice, now lowered half a register, carried not through amplification, but through control. "So before we start pointing fingers at Border Patrol agents," she said, eyes drifting toward the right side of the room, "at local officers, or even at parole decisions." She turned to look directly at Miller, whose jaw had visibly tightened, the edges of his mouth pulled taut with restraint. "Let's talk about who chose to ignore them," she continued, not with vengeance, but with precision. "Let's talk about who silenced the system, not to protect the people, but to preserve a narrative." That final line sat on the air like smoke refusing to clear. For a long moment, no one in the hall dared interrupt. The same crowd that had screamed, "How do you sleep at night?" just minutes earlier now stared forward in uneasy quiet. Some looked down at their laps, others at the floor. Even a few who had cheered Miller's earlier takedown now looked up at the screen again, as if the weight of what they'd just heard demanded review. Jasmine didn't look triumphant. She didn't smirk. Her shoulders didn't rise in pride. Because this wasn't about scoring points. It was about restoring reality. She wasn't fighting for a soundbite. She was fighting to force people to see how much had been stripped from the truth. How one system's political paranoia had overridden local warnings, drowned out frontline intelligence, and turned one tragedy into a weapon, while the cause remained hidden in plain sight. She didn't need to explain it. The audience felt it. The betrayal wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a paper trail. Stephen Miller, for the first time since the night began, looked down, not at his notes, not at the screen, but at the table in front of him. His face remained hard, unreadable. But something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, not defeat, but recalibration. He had crafted a narrative with heat and fury. She had responded with stone and fact. And now the audience, once pulled into the emotional high of spectacle, was sitting in the aftermath, trying to piece together what had really just happened. Jasmine returned to her seat, but the silence followed her. Not because she'd won, and not because Miller had lost, but because, for the first time in the evening, the crowd was no longer sure who they were supposed to believe. And that was the point. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the cheers. She needed the silence because, inside it, truth finally had room to breathe. The air was dense now, not with heat or humidity, but with something heavier. Truth unspoken, but close. Jasmine could feel it in the weight of every eye fixed on her, in the charged silence that followed the sheriff's testimony and the leaked internal memo. She had turned the tide, yes, but not enough to stop the storm Miller had unleashed. He still sat there, cloaked in cold confidence, backed by a cheering crowd that hungered not for complexity, but for vengeance. And Jasmine knew the only thing stronger than fear was proof. And she had come armed with it. Her fingers moved with steady precision as she reached to her left, sliding away a plain stack of legal notes and revealing something far more deliberate, a crimson-red envelope. It was thick, almost heavy, and its color wasn't accidental. It was a signal. It clashed against the muted colors of the stage, drawing the cameras like blood draws sharks. She didn't lift it fast. She didn't wave it theatrically. She raised it with the kind of control that made people lean forward involuntarily, like something dangerous was about to be opened. Not just figuratively, but literally. Her voice dropped into something deeper, something undeniable. If you like evidence, then I brought the entire library. The audience didn't know how to react. A few murmured, others froze in place. Even the production team paused, unsure whether to cut to commercial or stay on what was clearly turning into national political theater. Jasmine broke the seal with a quiet but unmistakable tear. It was the sound of intent, not hesitation. She reached inside and drew out one sheet. Just one. Not a stack, not a folder, not a packet of speculation. A single email. Printed, clean, fully visible to the audience and cameras. This, she said, holding the paper steady between her hands, was leaked by an internal staff member, someone who couldn't stomach the silence anymore. Her gaze never left Stephen Miller. Not once. It wasn't an accusatory glare. It was steadier than that, more practiced. It was the look of someone who had spent their life having to prove what others were simply allowed to declare. Jasmine had always known her words would be doubted unless they were tattooed in documentation. And tonight, she had come with ink. And before anyone claims forgery, she continued, her tone flattening just enough to reveal the emotional armor underneath, it's been authenticated. 3 independent journalists received the same file. I just got it first. Her words weren't about boasting. They were about removing every possible excuse Miller or his defenders might try to cling to. She wasn't just confronting a lie. She was cornering it. She stepped slightly toward the front edge of the stage, not to dramatize, but to command. And then she read, "Do not allocate support to State X at this time. Let them manage the crisis alone. We will leverage the disorder." It hit the crowd like a low detonation, not loud but powerful. The kind of sentence that didn't scream. It whispered in a voice that echoed for hours. The room didn't gasp this time. It stilled completely, as if every person had forgotten how to inhale. Words like "do not allocate support" were bureaucratic on paper. But when spoken in this room, in this moment, they became chilling, calculated, cruel. And Jasmine wasn't done. She lowered the paper slowly, deliberately, letting it fall back onto the table beside her like a closing file in a courtroom. Then with one single motion, she extended her arm and pointed, not vaguely, not generally, directly at Stephen Miller. "You know this letter." Her voice didn't rise, it compressed. "Because it came from your aide." The effect was instantaneous. The audience, which had only moments ago howled at her over a single grainy video of an unnamed immigrant, now sat like a jury whose star witness had just turned the entire trial inside out. They didn't move. They didn't clap. And that silence, that long, vibrating silence, was the most honest reaction of the night. Stephen Miller didn't blink, but his jaw had shifted, tightened, and in a room where every gesture was magnified, where every micro-expression could become a headline by morning, that twitch was thunder. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk. She simply let the truth settle into the cracks Miller had spent 20 minutes widening. She didn't need theatrics. She had the words. She had the proof. And she had the one thing his performance had not been built to survive. A paper trail that bled arrogance in black and white. She spoke again, softer now but no less commanding. Her voice threaded into the silence like a scalpel into skin. "So before we start pointing fingers at Border Patrol agents, at local officers, or even at parole decisions," she took a step forward, not threatening but unavoidable. "Let's talk about who chose to ignore them. Let's talk about who silenced the system, not to protect the people, but to preserve a narrative." And in that moment, the entire night shifted. Because this wasn't about immigration anymore. It wasn't about security or numbers or drones or surveillance footage. It was about something deeper, something older. It was about abuse of authority under the guise of strength. It was about power used not to protect the public, but to exploit its chaos. And now, finally, that mask had cracked. Somewhere near the back, a man who had stood and clapped for Miller earlier now sat rigid, arms crossed, frowning. On the left aisle, a woman who had started the night silent now leaned forward, her lips slightly parted, as if trying to process whether what she had just heard could possibly be real. Even the moderator looked off stage for a split second, as if asking the control team whether they needed to verify what was just said, or whether they should just let it happen. No one interrupted, not even Miller. The red envelope still sat on the table, open and empty, like the remains of a detonated device, and its effect lingered in every breath, every tightened jaw, every whisper that refused to come. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to say more. She had already said enough. The silence that followed Jasmine's revelation didn't bring relief. It brought heat. A heavy, invisible pressure settled over the stage, thickening with every second Miller remained seated, silent, exposed. The red envelope lay open like a spent shell, its contents undeniable, its impact still ringing in the air. For the first time that night, Miller's grip on the narrative faltered. He could feel the eyes, not just of the audience, but of the cameras, the country, maybe even his own allies, watching, waiting, calculating. Jasmine hadn't just responded. She had flipped the spotlight and burned through the artifice. And Stephen Miller, who had built a career on staying composed, now found his foundation cracking. He stood, too quickly. The suddenness betrayed him. It wasn't the rise of a man reclaiming authority. It was the reflex of someone cornered. His eyes were sharp but unfocused, scanning not the crowd but the silence itself, looking for a handhold. When he spoke, his voice was no longer measured. It was sharp, raw, and loud, not with confidence but with desperation dressed as indignation. "You're just performing," he snapped, his tone ricocheting off the studio walls. "This is theater for emotions, not a forum for policy." The words rang out, but they didn't echo the way he wanted them to. They landed awkwardly, jagged, hollow. No one applauded. No one cheered. In fact, the silence that followed grew heavier, more uncomfortable. It wasn't just that he had raised his voice. It was that he had lost control. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She let the noise fade like static. And then, with the weight of iron in her calm, she answered, not for him, but for the room. "You can interrupt me," she said, her voice steady, low, deliberate, "but you can't interrupt the truth." The clarity of it cut through everything, the tension, the hostility, even the stage lighting. And for one suspended moment, the power in the room shifted again, not through volume, but through certainty. Jasmine didn't need to rise. The truth had already stood on her behalf. The moderator, sensing the collision veering off script, raised her voice quickly, trying to regain control. "Please, both of you, maintain order. This is a dialogue, not a battlefield." But the battlefield wasn't on stage. It was beneath every word, every silence, every truth someone like Jasmine had to fight 10 times harder to say, just to be heard once. And tonight she had said it, loud and clear, without ever raising her voice. The room was still vibrating from Jasmine's last words, and yet something in her gaze said she wasn't finished, not even close. The red envelope was gone, the truth already delivered. But now came something heavier, not data, not scandal, not leaked emails or clipped videos. This wasn't a blow to credibility. It was a blow to conscience. She reached slowly to her left and pulled out a folded document. Plain white, no markings, no spectacle. Just a single sheet, creased neatly, worn slightly at the edges. And though the motion was quiet, the moment wasn't. People leaned in again, instinctively sensing the shift. This wasn't policy anymore. It was personal. Jasmine inhaled once, not nervously, but like someone preparing to carry a weight they've carried before. Then with unflinching clarity, she spoke. "You want to talk about consequences?" she asked, her tone lower now, more grounded and more dangerous in its restraint. "Then let me introduce you to Luis Herrera." She unfolded the document slowly, gently, as if the paper itself were fragile. Luis was 19. He was a college freshman, born in Mexico, brought to Texas at the age of 2. Straight A student, played varsity soccer, volunteered at a food bank, never had so much as a parking ticket. His DACA renewal was caught in a backlog, flagged in a system error, and within 10 days he was removed. She paused just for a breath, but the silence that followed wasn't absence. It was pain growing teeth. The audience was silent again, but this time it wasn't suspense. It was grief beginning to move. Jasmine continued. He called his mother from a holding facility in El Paso, said he didn't understand what was happening, said he hadn't done anything wrong. He was right. ICE marked him for expedited removal based on outdated data. They never reviewed his case file. He was flown to Tijuana. She glanced at the floor once, then looked back up. He didn't make it a week. Then came the moment no one expected. Jasmine lifted the document, a death certificate, slightly faded, the kind handed to grieving families in place of the person they couldn't bring home. She held it high as the camera zoomed in, as every viewer across the country saw the words, cause of death, blunt force trauma. Location, Cala Constitution, Tijuana, Baja California. She didn't break. Her voice didn't crack. If anything, it got steadier. He wasn't a criminal. He was a dream. She looked directly at Miller now. Her words struck like a hammer. He was a dream killed by the machine you designed. That was the fracture point. The emotional energy in the room, long held hostage by anger, suddenly flipped, violently and without warning. People who had come expecting to cheer were now gripping their chair arms. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Somewhere in the middle, a man lowered his eyes and whispered something to no one. And near the back, someone wept, quietly but audibly enough to remind everyone this was no longer political theater. This was grief, and grief didn't care who you voted for. Jasmine didn't revel in the silence. She stood still, holding the death certificate like a mirror. The audience stared not just at her, but through her, into a system that had been described in graphs and statistics for hours, but had only now found a human face. Stephen Miller didn't move. His mouth was set, eyes unreadable, but for the first time there was no flicker of response, no smirk, no dismissal. Because what could he say? This wasn't theory. This wasn't spin. This was a 19-year-old boy whose body had been returned in a box. And now in this room, his story had been unboxed in front of millions. Jasmine slowly lowered the page, folded it once again with the same care, and placed it on the desk in front of her. Then she spoke, not to Miller anymore, but to the audience, the people who might have come in thinking she was loud, radical, too much. She didn't beg. She didn't accuse. She just told the truth. Luis was failed, she said softly, not because of a broken border, but because of a broken priority, because someone somewhere decided fear was worth more than review. Speed was worth more than process. And that choice cost a 19-year-old boy his life. A sob escaped from somewhere near the back. Others didn't cry, but they stared, wide-eyed and quiet, like the illusion had finally burned away. For 30 seconds, no one moved. Even the moderator didn't speak. The stage lights dimmed just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. Shadows that now seemed to stretch straight from Luis Herrera's name to the heart of American immigration policy. Jasmine sat down slowly. The seat didn't creak. The moment didn't break. Because there was nothing to break. It had already broken. And from that silence came something stronger than applause, stronger than argument. It was reckoning. And reckoning, when it comes, doesn't shout. It mourns. The echo of Luis Herrera's name still lingered in the air as the broadcast cut to commercial. But the real eruption didn't come from the studio. It came from the world outside. Within seconds, screenshots of the confrontation began flooding the digital bloodstream. One still image in particular spread like wildfire. Stephen Miller, mid-outburst, veins tight in his neck, mouth twisted in fury, eyes locked in accusation, juxtaposed with Jasmine Crockett, seated calmly, holding the crimson envelope high like a judge with a sealed verdict. It didn't take long for the internet to crown the moment. Across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, A meme emerged, reshared by the thousands and captioned with 10 brutal, unforgettable words. She brought evidence. He brought anger. The image didn't just go viral, it went ballistic. Influencers posted it. Journalists retweeted it. College students made it their lock screens. In a digital age where seconds define legacy, this was the moment that stuck. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. One side shouting, one side showing. The contrast was so stark, so cinematic, that it practically demanded to be screenshot. But the meme wasn't just style, it carried weight. Beneath the humor, beneath the viral punch, it spoke to a deeper fracture in the national psyche. People weren't just reacting to a debate. They were reacting to decades of gaslighting, to a system that taught people like Jasmine Crockett that the only way to be heard was to arrive overprepared, flawless, relentless, armed with documentation, while men like Miller could weaponize emotion and be applauded for it. And now the roles had flipped, on live television, in real time. Fact-checkers mobilized with lightning speed. Within the hour, three major news outlets, Reuters, The Washington Post, and ProPublica, published independent confirmations. The email from Miller's aide was authentic, traced to a policy planning memo circulated internally last spring. The death certificate of Luis Herrera, verified through municipal records in Baja California. The testimony from Sheriff Dalton Reyes, already public record, pulled from a city hearing archived online. The red envelope hadn't just been symbolic, it had been bulletproof. One journalist put it plainly in a late-night segment. In a media climate where politicians often argue over perception, Representative Crockett dealt in documentation. Her facts weren't only sharp, they were airtight. Meanwhile, online sentiment only surged. A side-by-side GIF circulated. On the left, Miller slamming his hand against the table. On the right, Jasmine calmly unfolding the death certificate of Luis Herrera. The caption read, "When you lose the argument, raise your voice. When you have the truth, raise the paper." It was devastating, but beneath the viral momentum was a deeper recognition. One Jasmine Crockett had earned with every controlled breath that night. This wasn't just a debate victory, this was survival. This was what it looked like when a black woman walked into a room built to break her and refused to bend. Not with louder words, but with irrefutable facts. And still, the injustice of it wasn't lost on anyone paying close attention. Because what made the moment viral wasn't just the clarity of her argument. It was the uphill terrain she had to cross just to deliver it. Miller didn't need to provide full context. He didn't need to explain the chain of decisions behind a policy. He didn't even need to cite accurate numbers. All he had to do was raise his voice, flash a single video, and the room had roared. Jasmine? She needed authenticated emails, sworn testimony, a death certificate, and the patience of a saint to even be heard above the noise. And yet she did it. The injustice wasn't in the fact that she won. It was in how much harder she had to work just to stand on equal footing. More memes followed. One showed a stack of folders labeled Crockett Immigration Briefs, Source Docs, Federal Testimony, next to a lone post-it labeled Miller Vibes. Another mimicked a classic courtroom movie poster, with Jasmine seated like a calm prosecutor, and Miller mid-yell, eyes wide, face blurred in rage. The tagline read, "In the court of public opinion, truth speaks calmly." By midnight, news anchors were already dubbing it a watershed moment. Cable networks debated whether Miller's outburst would hurt his credibility in future policy circles. But online, the people had already decided. The top comment on a video clip of the confrontation read, "We just watched the arc of American politics bend toward receipts." And Jasmine, she didn't tweet, she didn't post, she didn't ride the viral wave, because she didn't need to. The moment spoke louder than any caption ever could. Her silence, too, was strategic. Let the facts echo without interruption. But the image remained. Miller, face twisted in fury, undone by a woman who never raised her voice, only raised the truth. And in that haunting, now iconic meme, the story of that night was preserved forever. She brought evidence. He brought anger. And the country, for once, saw the difference. The meme was everywhere. The headline war had begun. But while Jasmine's calm defiance lit up timelines and front pages, Stephen Miller, once the architect of outrage, the undisputed master of televised control, vanished, not slowly, not gradually. He disappeared like a system shutting down under overload. The next morning, producers at 3 major networks reported the same message. Miller had pulled out. No statement, no substitution, no explanation. The bookings, Fox, Newsmax, even a pre-taped appearance scheduled with a conservative think tank, all gone. Just like that, the man who had framed himself as untouchable left a silence louder than any interview he could have given. It wasn't just tactical retreat. It was damage control bleeding into containment. His media team, usually loud, aggressive, fast to retaliate, went dark. Phones rang to voicemail. Emails bounced with auto-replies. No rebuttal tweets, no friendly columnists sent out to shift the narrative. In the age of instant spin, this kind of void wasn't just absence. It was admission. Someone inside the machine had finally pulled the brakes. Producers whispered off the record. He looked rattled. Staffers described an emergency meeting at his D.C. office that ran past midnight, with one aide walking out in tears. His closest advisors were seen entering and leaving through side doors, shielding their faces from cameras now stationed outside. He wasn't just wounded, he was cornered. And the world was watching. The irony, of course, was razor sharp. A man who had built his persona on framing others as weak now found himself unable to face a single round of follow-up questions. Because how do you spin away a death certificate? How do you debate a red envelope whose contents had already been verified, line by line, live and in front of the nation? Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't even celebrated the moment. She had simply laid out the truth, and it had left him no room to move. And while she moved forward, invited to panels, quoted in editorials, respected in new spaces, Stephen Miller's empire of control was, for the first time, completely silent. No rebuttal, no interviews, no spin cycle to reclaim the narrative. Just a man in the middle of a media blackout, haunted by the sound of his own unraveling. The silence that followed Stephen Miller's disappearance became more than a media void. It became a vacuum waiting to be filled. And it didn't take long before the country turned toward the only person who had spoken with calm, with conviction, and with proof. Jasmine Crockett hadn't chased the spotlight, but it found her anyway. Not because she had gone viral, not because she had humiliated a man known for being untouchable on right-wing media, but because she had survived a rigged confrontation with the most dangerous weapon imaginable, the truth, printed, notarized, and undeniable. The invitations began quietly in the hours after the broadcast. A university law symposium emailed her team requesting a guest lecture on constitutional enforcement in immigration policy. Then came the Human Rights Accountability Network, asking her to keynote a forum on federal overreach. Within 48 hours, over 24 conferences had reached out. Civil liberties organizations, immigration task forces, even whistleblower protection groups. Each invitation was a reflection of something that couldn't be denied. Jasmine had spoken not just facts, but something sacred. She had spoken the language of the unheard, with documentation, not anger. And now America wanted more of it. But Jasmine didn't accept everything. She didn't rush into media tours or trade authenticity for polished applause. She was methodical, focused. She read every request. She chose the places that mattered. The rooms where truth had long been dismissed as emotional, unless it came wearing a suit and tie, delivered by someone without an accent or a history of being ignored. When she walked into those rooms, she didn't change tone. She didn't adjust for comfort. She brought the red envelope with her, sometimes literally, always metaphorically. She told the story, not in rage, but in sequence. She spoke of Luis Herrera and held the death certificate up once more, her voice steadier with each telling. She described the internal memo and the decision to leverage the disorder with a level of calm that made it hurt more. She spoke of the night on live television when she sat across from a man who believed louder meant stronger, and how she watched him unravel the moment the facts arrived. And every time, without fail, She ended with a line that had first emerged like a final strike, but had since become something larger, something almost sacred. When fear is made legal, the truth must come armed with paperwork. It didn't sound like a catchphrase. It sounded like prophecy. Those 10 words began to take on a life of their own. Law students quoted it in moot court. Immigration lawyers had it framed above their desks. Journalists used it to open editorials. For organizers who had been screaming into the void for years about silent deportations, racial profiling, policy gaslighting, it became a rallying cry not of rage, but of focus, of strategy, of fire wrapped in precision. Jasmine hadn't just exposed something corrupt, she had revealed what it takes to survive it. On college campuses, the image of her holding the red envelope became iconic. One widely circulated photo showed her mid-sentence, standing behind a wooden podium at a law school lecture hall, the envelope tucked against her chest like a badge. The quote printed in bold white across the bottom read, "When fear is made legal, the truth must come armed with paperwork." Within a week, the image was printed on hundreds of protest posters across 3 states. Not by her team, by people who had watched that night and understood something deeper. That in America, the burden of proof had always been heavier for those who looked like her, and that she had carried it anyway, all the way to the front of the stage. There were no choreographed cheers, no confetti moments, just a rising current of respect, of realization, of something raw finally being heard. And in the background of every stage, in the margins of every slide, in the silence after every keynote, the words remained. When fear is made legal, the truth must come armed with paperwork. And in that stillness, it was no longer just her story. It was everyone's who had ever been dismissed for being too loud, too emotional, too undocumented, too inconvenient. And now, finally, someone had spoken for them, with proof. The red envelope had become legend. The quote was etched into protest signs, classroom walls, and legal blogs. But what truly cemented the moment into national consciousness was not just the outrage it sparked or the silence it shattered. It was how it entered the realm of education. Because in the weeks following the broadcast, law schools across the country began to take notice. Not as spectators, not as commentators, as institutions that understood they had just witnessed a textbook moment in real-time crisis management, constitutional confrontation, and the forensic use of verified fact. The shift began subtly. A professor at New York University Law mentioned the debate in a seminar on evidence strategy. Then Yale's School of Government created a mock trial scenario built entirely around the exchange between Crockett and Miller, complete with timelines, digital forensics, and redacted documents handed to students to dissect. At Harvard, a constitutional law class added an entire module titled Paper versus Power, Truth in the Age of Spectacle, with Jasmine Crockett's performance as its anchor. What was once just a viral moment had transformed into a case study, now taught alongside historical courtroom clashes and landmark Supreme Court hearings. It wasn't the drama they were studying, it was the structure beneath it. Professors walked students through each beat of the broadcast, how Crockett didn't react to provocation, how she paused instead of pounced, how she let Miller burn through his outrage before calmly sliding a document across the table. The control, the timing, the tactical use of silence, the weaponization of authenticity, and most importantly, the decision to bring proof, documents that could survive not just a debate, but discovery. What made the lesson stick wasn't just the legal prowess, it was the moral imbalance students couldn't unsee. Here was a black woman grilled under the heat of a hostile studio, burdened with defending humanity in front of a national audience that expected her to fail. And yet, she didn't just survive. She dismantled her opponent without ever raising her voice. And the most unsettling part? She had to bring more than facts. She had to bring flawless, verified, defensible truth, because anything less would have been dismissed as emotional. One visiting lecturer put it bluntly during a session at UCLA Law. This wasn't just a debate. This was a courtroom without a judge, where one party shouted and the other had to bring their own stenographer, exhibit log, and closing statement. At Georgetown, a student-led journal published a special edition analyzing the incident. Its title, When Silence Isn't Safe, The Crockett Response and the Weaponization of Calm. In one section, they reconstructed the debate second by second, analyzing body language, tone shifts, rhetorical pivots, and how Crockett created narrative momentum without interrupting, insulting, or performing. Another article from the same journal examined the cultural burden placed on marginalized voices to prove, 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 when others could simply accuse. And in those classrooms, something else happened. Students started to see the invisible lines, how systemic bias didn't just exist in policy, but in expectation, in how one person's emotional reaction became passion, while another's composed response was called calculated. Jasmine Crockett didn't change that reality. She exposed it and then flipped it live on national television. One professor summarized it best during a workshop on crisis communication. She didn't argue harder, she argued smarter. She didn't match his volume. She brought verified documentation, and in doing so, she rewrote the rules of political confrontation for everyone who's ever been told they're too much for simply refusing to be silent. The footage is now part of digital archives. Students queue it up alongside Watergate hearings and Clarence Darrow's closing arguments. But what sets this moment apart is that it wasn't prepped in a courtroom or rehearsed in legal clinics. It happened in real time, in a room designed to overwhelm her, and she turned it into a masterclass. The final frame of most class discussions returns to that one iconic moment. Crockett, seated under the lights, the red envelope in her hand, and the phrase now carved into national memory like a constitutional amendment. When fear is made legal, the truth must come armed with paperwork. And in that image, students don't just see a debate, they see what justice looks like when it refuses to flinch. Of all the lessons dissected in classrooms and rewatched on loop, none lingered longer than the human truth underneath it all. Beyond the red envelope, beyond the paperwork and the forensic precision, there was something deeper, something elemental that couldn't be graded or footnoted. It was the part no one could teach in a textbook, what it feels like to stand alone in a room designed to silence you and still choose not to bend. As the footage played in lecture halls and public forums, students didn't just study Jasmine Crockett's argument structure, they saw her steady hands. They saw how her eyes didn't flinch when Miller raised his voice. They noticed how she took that final breath before revealing the death certificate, knowing the emotional toll it would cost her and doing it anyway. Because sometimes the only way to defend the voiceless is to carry their weight into the fire yourself. What Jasmine brought to that stage wasn't just a masterclass in strategy. It was a lesson in humanity's most fragile truth, that dignity, when stripped from policy, becomes a corpse wrapped in rhetoric. Her story, Luis's story, wasn't just about immigration. It was about what we choose to protect, comfort or character, power or people. When she held up that folded certificate, she didn't just hold up evidence, she held up consequence. And in that moment, the room wasn't watching a debate, it was watching a reckoning. Because behind every statistic Miller weaponized, there was a name, a life, a mother who waited by a phone that stopped ringing. The injustice wasn't abstract, it was intimate. The system had not failed accidentally. It had failed by design. And Jasmine, with her calm voice and impossible burden, forced a nation to stare straight into that design and ask itself, are we okay with this? That's why people wept in the audience. Not because of spectacle, but because for once, someone refused to dehumanize the victim to win an argument. She didn't reduce Luis to a case number. She resurrected him as a person. And that, more than any memo or quote, was what broke the room open. The emotional weight of the night rippled outward far beyond policy circles. Veterans, teachers, grocery clerks, people with no stake in immigration law, wrote posts, sent letters, shared tears. They weren't responding to legislation. They were responding to the clarity of pain that Jasmine had delivered with surgical restraint. Because what she taught was not just about government failure, it was about moral obligation. That when the law is used to disguise cruelty, it is not just a political flaw, it is a failure of soul. She didn't frame the issue in abstractions. She didn't call it injustice. She made people feel what injustice costs. That's what elevated the moment from memorable to transformational. Jasmine had not come to play the game. She had come to put a mirror in front of it. And for those watching, especially those who had spent their lives on the receiving end of broken systems, it was the first time they'd seen someone stand in that room, in that pressure, and make truth undeniable. That's the difference between politics and principle. Anyone can talk policy on paper, but it takes something else, something far harder, to sit in front of a camera, next to a man shouting over you, and choose not to shout back, but to speak for the dead, to speak for the overlooked, and to do so with a calm that's not silence, but steel. And it wasn't just about being right, it was about being ready. Jasmine Crockett was ready. She had the documents, the names, the timestamps. She knew the moment would come when someone would try to bulldoze her with volume, and she brought something louder than anger. She brought truth in a language the system couldn't ignore. Receipts. That's what made the moment historic, and it's also what made it tragic. Because here was the quiet part said out loud. She had to come that prepared. She had to be flawless. She had to anticipate every angle of doubt and every spin of distraction, not to win, but just to survive the exchange, just to be believed. And yet she bore that weight with grace, not because she wanted to, but because she knew millions of people carry it every day and never get to speak into a microphone. She spoke for them, not just with fire, but with evidence, with mourning, with control. And in that, she delivered a lesson that no panel, no lecture, no academic white paper ever could. That the burden of truth in America is not equally distributed. That the voices most required to be calm are often the ones screaming to be heard. That justice doesn't fail by accident, it fails by permission. And that sometimes the only way to keep it honest is to show up not with a slogan, but with a folder full of facts and the spine to read them when it hurts. Her courage wasn't performative, it was practiced. And her words, especially that final line, became not just a reflection of her strategy, but of her survival. When fear is made legal, the truth must come armed with paperwork. Those weren't just words, they were a warning. And in hearing them, we weren't just learning about immigration. We were learning what it means to live in a world where truth isn't protected unless it's proven, and what it takes to carry that proof into the light. And when the truth had finally settled, etched into paper, sealed in memory, and burned into the conscience of a nation, there was only one direction left to look: forward. Jasmine didn't end with applause. She ended with a demand. Not for sympathy, not for praise, for action. She looked into the camera, into every home that had watched from a safe distance, and delivered what felt less like a speech and more like a final warning wrapped in fire. If this system can bury Luis, it can bury anyone. If truth has to beg for a microphone, then every one of us has a responsibility to hold it higher. Don't just watch, don't just share, organize, speak, question, demand paper, demand oversight, demand justice with ink and spine. The room had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of reckoning, the silence before a crowd stands. And across the country, people didn't just applaud, they moved, because Jasmine didn't come to win a moment. She came to ignite one, and now the fire was ours to carry. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.